the disappearance of civil liberties, the Abbott coalition agenda. So, for the first time in a long time, politics in the pub is guilty of false advertising. Because apparently it's Republican, I forget what the guy's name is, Turnbull. It's something, I think it's a universally important topic. I mean, it's referring to Australia, but having just spent 3 weeks in the Middle East, the disappearance of civil liberties is, in some ways, the word disappearance is false in itself, because it's as though civil liberties were once well entrenched there. The two speakers are in some ways household names in this city, or if not in this state. Peter Manning's a good friend of mine, at least he was before I started to make remarks about him. He's a former executive producer of Four Corners. He's responsible for starting Late Line, Landline, and Foreign Correspondent, among other things. And is well known for having a terrible disagreement with the managing director of the ABC over the wisdom of the Iraq War. So, and Peter actually was one of the first people to start to protest about the treatment of Q&A. You may remember when an otherwise unknown national MP, I think, made a lot of noise about the conduct of Q&A. On Peter's right, but certainly not politically, is one of the most significant political voices in this state, David Shoebridge, who's a Greens MP in the upper house, and I wish he was in the Labour Party in many ways. I don't know whether David regards that as an insult.
I do, yes.
David's a barrister. David is such a good citizen that he's given up time to come here tonight on his birthday. The first speaker is Peter Manning. You know the format, 20 minutes for each of two speakers, and then a collection to bring down the Turnbull government.
Yeah! Well, of course, coming from the ABC, I have to be balanced on all these matters. So I can't, take up that challenge that Stuart just gave me. Though I must say that having left day-to-day journalism in the year 2000, which is so long ago, and taken up the academic and book writing and all that sort of stuff life, I've made it my life's journey to actually say what I think. And I have a blog called us-and-them.com.au, where I, rail against the darkness and the forces of darkness. And I've been, in particular, talking about civil liberties and our drift towards fascism in this country. And I don't think it's changed anything. I don't think Tony Abbott has gone because of my Us and Them blog site. But it's been great to vent. And I think in following, I'm a big supporter of Palestine and devoted quite a lot of my last 15 years to defending Muslims and Arabs and particularly Palestinians against demonisation and discrimination and so on and so on. But in looking back over that time from the war in Iraq, following the earlier wars in Iraq, one of the big things that has actually upset me personally, and I think taken personally, is the loss of our civil liberties. The constant erosion from September 11, 2001 onward of our civil liberties. And I don't think that's been a political party matter. I think it's been a federal government matter, and I think it's extremely serious. As a result of the anti-terrorism bill that John Howard brought in not long after September 11, you can be taken away for a week, no explanation given to your family or to anybody as to why you've suddenly disappeared. You have no legal rights to appeal this incarceration, and you would not know, because it's not possible for the media to report that you have been taken away. Now that was the first, one of the first elements of the Anti-Terrorism Act that was passed by John Howard all those years ago. And so from that denial of civil liberties, which is truly extraordinary, so no one, not only would you not know, but it could not even be reported that this has actually happened, whether you're guilty or innocent. That was the start of the rundown of our civil liberties. And I remember, you know, just a sort of personal side of this, that when John Howard went slightly berserk with all these kind of, you know, how are we going to handle these Muslims and Arabs and so on, so on, so on after September 11. I remember my 4-year-old grandson and I being on a ferry, and Carol, I think, and my other grandson as well. And he piped up and he looked at this, he was looking at this thing on the Manly Ferry, and it said, if you see something, say something. And Jude, being a thoughtful, slightly internalised kind of boy, had just read that, and, you know, if you see something, say something. And he said, Grandpa, what does that actually mean? I found it very difficult to explain, you know, what was it you were supposed to see that would make you say something, and to whom? You know, like to me, or to the person on the ferry next to them, or what? It was just, as we all remember, and I think that slogan is still, I've seen it on trains and things too, it's still around, that sense of generalised fear about the other, who could be on this ferry, who could be on this train, who could be on, you know, opposite the customs building in the city or something or other. And they're a bit strange, and you need to say something about that. Now that be afraid mantra, we've now lived with for quite a long time, and a different generation of people lived through the Cold War, which had that kind of feeling too. And now we've had the same kind of feeling, but it's much more specific. It's about the Middle East, it's about terrorists, it's about people who come from the countries, by the way, that we've invaded, Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and all these places, and they come on boats and they come to our country. For God's sake, why are they coming to our country? So Jude was picking up, my grandson was picking up on that thing, and I think it was very intelligent, emotionally intelligent of him to do so. So I do want to talk about 5 specific areas where I think serious infringements have occurred that mean that we are living in a much different world, not just about the other and the threats that we face, but about how we can actually act and what our democratic life is like. And I just want to say in one sentence that if you go back before 2001, Australia wasn't the greatest free country in the world, actually, and as a journalist, the defamation laws in Australia were and are extremely stringent. We've unfortunately gained the worst of the British system of law in terms of defamation law, and that is extremely restrictive on what people can do, say, report, and so on, so on, so on. And very high tests about, is it in the public interest, and was the research done, so on, so on, so on. Whereas in America, which has got a wonderful constitution which builds in all these freedoms about information, and they believe in freedom of information, and they have much better freedom of information laws. The defamation law is much looser on, particularly to gives its citizenry a decent chance to have debate about things. Not in Australia. You know, at the risk of hurting someone's reputation, hurting reputation is far more important than having a public debate. So we weren't that free either within Western societies prior to September 11, 2001. And if you add on top of that, monopoly control of our media, Australia being one of the highest monopolised countries in the world when it comes to media, plus then a whole series of anti-discrimination laws and so on, which are, you know, quite fine and totally understandable. There are a lot of restrictions on what can be said in the media. Okay, so when it came to first point, the consequences of September 11, 2001. I remember a time when, for instance, with the Ustasha fascist group, who had people in Australia who used to go out and do military exercises out west of Liverpool, and I remember interviewing one guy who'd shot himself in the foot in one of these exercises, that as long as they didn't do anything, they didn't threaten anyone in, you know, Australia, and they didn't actually make efforts to go and fight overseas and so on, and they were just playing these kind of silly games and threatening people. It was not a crime to threaten. It was not a crime to verbalise. It was a crime when you did something, when you acted. And since September 11, it has become much looser in that, in my view, in that crossover. What you think, who you support, what you might indicate by your actions or your SMSs or your emails or your phone calls or any of those kinds of things are now much more liable to bring down the full force of the law. Now, I think that itself is a very big shift from action to thought, and it's crucial. And you hear lots of people, lots of times saying, you know, well, this person said this, so that means he must be supporting terrorism. No, it doesn't mean he's supporting terrorism. He might be supporting, for instance, the right of Middle Eastern people not to be invaded by Western countries every 10 years, including us, starting with Napoleon. You know, so that doesn't make him a terrorist, doesn't mean he's going to go over and join one or other of these many groups that don't like it. It just means he's expressing an opinion which might be forcefully put. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that of consequence of September 11, I think, was the sense of shock and panic that meant that we dissolved a whole lot of boundaries about what government could do. The shift between government and the individual. George Williams has written a lot about this in the University of New South Wales and also in the Sydney Morning Herald, that the shift of power has gone towards government, towards Canberra, towards them making judgments about us as against the civilian right to know. And that act that I talked about, where you can be taken away, which still exists, you can be taken away in the middle of the night. That was how a piece of panic legislation, in my view, by John Howard, and incidentally supported by the Labor Party when they came to power. Did that provision, you know, be struck out by the first thing that that a Whitlam government might have done, but not a Rudd government, nor a Gillard government? Was it ever struck out? No, it wasn't. It still exists. And then finally, of course, this pattern of creeping involvement by the state in your affairs happens, of course, last October when the Abbott government introduces through George Brandis as the Attorney General the latest amendments to the Anti-Terrorism Act, which were heartily condemned by journalists particularly, but also by civil libertarians. And in particular, it's called the National Security Amendment Bill 2014. Journalists can now be jailed for up to 10 years for disclosing information on covert intelligence operations, and up to 10 years if that disclosure endangers lives. Now, you'll remember the spying on the Indonesian president and his wife. Now, that was a covert intelligence operation. Many would regard that as inappropriate behaviour on the part of Australia, and certainly the Indonesian president and his wife certainly regarded it as beyond the pale. When that was revealed, that under this new legislation, this 35p section of this Act could have got that journalist jailed for 10 years. Instead, he won a Walkley Award. But we had this amazing disconnect between the government, the Abbott government. I'll come to the Turnbull government in a minute. We have this amazing disconnect between citizens' rights and government movement towards abrogating those rights. And to my mind, this has been such a consistent 15-year process since September 11 that you haven't had the kind of riots that we saw in the street the other day when the Immigration Department, Border Police, thought they might just go and have a look at anyone they liked on the streets of Melbourne. Because there hasn't been one spot, I suppose, where it was possible to say enough is enough. It's been a creeping infiltration of people's rights. And with these special operations that this Act has, whereas with something like defamation law, you have a way of defeating the action taken against you in the media. You have a way of defeating it, which is to claim that it was in the public interest for the public to know about this matter that was published. In this law, there is no such test. It's not about whether it was verifiable. It's not about whether it was in the public interest. It's not about whether right to know. It's about the fact that you actually reported it at all. So there's no caveats about it. There's no defences. The fact that you reported it. So going backwards, the fact that the reporter reported about the espionage on the Indonesian leaders could have and would today get 10 years in jail. Now that's the state we're in. That's where we are. And it may be, I mean, I was thinking, what stories can I actually think tonight to talk about which broke that? And I can't actually think. Since that October 2014 legislation went through, what are the big security stories that have been broken? There aren't that many. I can't think of any. I can't think of any big stories like that. And I suspect that's exactly what they call the chilling effect on journalism that has occurred. How do we know? Well, we don't know. That's the problem. What stories did people like Peter Harcher, Mark Kenny, you know, etc., 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 look at and say, do I want 10 years in jail? And on a recent media watch, Peter Harcher was saying, well, if it's 10 years in jail for me as against disclosing the information, I know which way I'll go, which is not 10 years in jail, thanks. So how many stories do we now not know over the last year, since October, that we should know? And this is, that kind of double think is a Soviet double think. It's a Koestler sort of double think, really, because you're kind of going, you know, what do I ought to know that I don't know? The other thing to say about this legislation, I'm sorry, Professor George Williams was saying on the ABC, the reality is that journalists who value their physical freedom will be scared off from reporting on intelligence operations. Now, I actually taught at UTS. I know a couple of excellent defence reporters. I taught one of them. He's now at the ABC. He has actually not done what they call special ops expose, but he has done some other reporting, which is very good. But, you know, you'd be a brave young man at 28 or something or other, you know, probably, I think in his case with a young family, to go and do the story and suddenly find you're disappearing. So here, for instance, is the summing up by a media lawyer. And the media lawyers, used to be an excellent lawyer called Bruce Donald at the ABC when I was running News and Current Affairs. The current kind of doyen of media lawyers is a guy called Matthew Collins, QC, and he said, in response to this legislation, I'm deeply concerned at the culture in Australia which has involved the chipping away of freedom of expression. Once you're allowed to be chipped away, it becomes very hard to stop it. This is on Media Watch, by the way. We've reached a stage where freedom of expression has been quite seriously limited in this country in a way which would simply not be tolerated in countries like the US, the UK and Canada. So that's, again, that's where we're at. This country, and incidentally, in terms of the actual number of amendments to anti-terrorism laws, meaning, you know, screwing it up, hardening it up as a piece of legislation, Australia is one of the leaders of hardening up its anti-terrorism laws over the last 15 years. Okay, so I think I must be coming to the end of my time. I've got plenty of stuff to keep going, but I do want to say just a couple of other things in conclusion. that Anti-Terrorism Act and the series of anti-terrorism acts over the period, plus the the Defamation Act and the monopolisation of the media. But just quickly, let me list these things that have also infringed our freedom. The data surveillance laws which have come in which they said to us, oh, the telcos have been doing that for years. Oh, really? Who said that? Who revealed that? Who gave us the right to... Who said that the telcos were recording all our data in terms of SMSs and emails and you know, who we were ringing, who we weren't ringing? And 7:30 Report has done several stories showing how easy it is. I mean, one of the defences is about, oh no, but it's not about content. How easy it is to go, this person's ringing this person's a lawyer, this person's a political person, so on, so on, so on. And within, you know, 3 minutes you can put together, they sent this SMS, they sent that, you know, email, they walked from here to there, you know, they made this phone call, game over. Know exactly what all this is about. So that applies to all of us within the period of the 15 years I'm talking about. The Zaki Mallah case on Q&A, which I stuck my neck out about, what was wrong with having Zaki Mallah sitting in the audience being abused by the Minister for Immigration when the point he was making was that the kind of lack of consultation by the federal government, the Abbott government at that time, with the Muslim community was alienating people, which in turn would send them overseas. So what was the problem? Then he was abused by the minister, and then he goes, oh, for God's sake, you know, whatever it was. I mean, hey, this is a debate on national television, on the ABC. And just, you know, quickly, how many voices suddenly were in? He was a danger to everybody. He wasn't a danger to anybody. He was, you know, treated like everybody else who comes into, you know, I mean, there were 500, 300 people in the audience. They were all, I know, you know, looked at and checked out by the producers and the researchers and the executive producer of Q&A as a matter of course. Of course they knew what his general views were, that's the idea. There was nothing wrong with having Zaki Mallah participating in the debate, and the very furore about he should never have been asked, which the Sydney Morning Herald and other people were saying, it showed how us and them we think in terms of this community in Australia and their lack of a right to have their say. And then there's the citizenship laws. And now we've got Australia flicking off certain citizens that they don't like. And it's perfectly simple for someone who's a business person visiting an area in Syria that is a no-go area declared by the government. How in the hell someone in the middle of Syria would know that the Australian government back in Canberra has made this a no-go area? But anyway, say they did and they were going to see their family or they were going to see their business partner or something or other, that's a massive time in jail. And the loss of your citizenship. When did we get this idea of you declare people non-citizens? And to me, that's another indicator of a drift towards fascism. Okay, I'll finish simply by saying, number one, Labor has been along with this agenda the entire way through. A few amendments, but wedged on the national security, you know, flagpole. I think that's a mix of metaphors, but anyway, you know what I mean. and from a Liberal point of view, this has very much been a fundamentalist right-wing attack on our freedoms. Now, Malcolm Turnbull has already, in the first week, broken 2 promises, one about climate change and one about same-sex marriage. How good will he be in standing up to the defence establishment, supported by both Labor and Liberal for the last 15 years, and saying, let's roll back some of these laws to give people their freedom back? I doubt it. Thank you.